All right, so today we're really diving deep into something pretty fascinating, I think. It's all about how our brains learn and grow. We're going to be looking at Limitless Mind by Boaler. She's a Stanford professor, and she's worked with brain scientists to kind of figure out what truly unlocks our potential when it comes to learning. So yeah, get ready for some surprising stuff about what you're actually capable of.
Definitely. Whether you want to master a new skill, get a handle on some complex topic, or just because you're curious about how the mind works,
Oh,
this is going to be pretty eye-opening.
yeah.
So today, our goal really is to kind of sift through all the information and bring you the most impactful and unexpected takeaways from this research. We're going to fast-track your understanding of your brain's incredible capacity.
I like that, like fast track. Yeah, think of this deep dive as like your personal guide to understanding how the latest brain science can actually change what you think is possible for you.
Absolutely.
And these aren't just like theories, they have real world implications for like everyone, learners of all kinds, right? Like no matter
Mhm.
your background. And at the heart of it is this fundamental shift, moving away from that old idea that our abilities are fixed. Like you're born with a certain amount of intelligence and that's it. And instead embracing this idea of brain plasticity, that our brains are constantly changing and developing.
Yeah, that's the exciting part, really.
Yeah.
The fact that our brains are not static.
Yeah.
So to illustrate this power of change, let's look at an example from the book.
Yep.
So Boaler discusses a study by Erickson on memory. He started with this, average college student named Steve. Steve could initially only remember like 7 or 8 random numbers. But with focused practice, something pretty amazing happened. He was able to shatter his perceived limits and ended up being able to recall an astounding 82 random digits.
82.
Yeah.
Wow. It really makes you think about what we're capable of if we just, put our minds to it. But it raises a question, why do some people seem to unlock so much more potential than others?
That's right. That's a really important question.
Yeah.
And the book delves into this by comparing Steve to another participant, Renee.
Okay.
Initially, Renee actually improved quite a bit, getting close to remembering 20 digits.
Okay.
But then she hit a wall, and she eventually dropped out of the study. And this was despite putting in more effort.
Mm.
So the difference between Steve and Renee became a central point. Was Steve just naturally gifted?
Ah.
The book addresses this skepticism head-on.
Okay.
Erickson repeated the experiment with another participant, Dario. Dario went on to memorize over 100 numbers. So the key finding here is that none of these individuals had some innate advantage.
Wow.
They were all just ordinary people.
So their incredible feats were purely the result of effort and practice.
Exactly. Their incredible memory feats were purely a result of effort and practice.
That's so cool. So effort really trumps what we often think of as natural talent.
It does. And that's why it's so important to understand that these fixed ideas about our abilities can be so limiting they can prevent us from even trying or cause us to give up too soon.
Right. Believing that our intelligence or skills are fixed, that can be a real barrier to reaching our full potential. Okay, so we've touched upon this concept of our brains being able to change. Let's dive into the science behind that, this idea of limitless potential.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
The discovery that really changed our understanding is neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity.
And it was largely thanks to the work of Michael Merzenich and his team.
Okay.
They were studying monkeys' brains, and they used these innovative techniques to create what they called mind maps. These are like
Yeah.
detailed blueprints of the brain's activity.
So they basically mapped these brain networks.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting. When they later revisited these maps, they made a remarkable discovery.
Okay.
The brain networks that they had documented had actually changed,
Oh.
and they changed rapidly. This was completely unexpected.
Hmm.
Merzenich himself was astounded. He didn't understand initially how this was even possible. But the only explanation was that the monkeys' brains were physically rewiring themselves.
So the adult brain wasn't a finished product after all.
Exactly. The adult brain isn't fixed. It can actually forge new connections and pathways.
I bet that was a pretty challenging idea for, the established scientific community to accept.
You're absolutely right. For a long time, the prevailing belief was that the adult brain was essentially fixed.
Hmm.
The idea that it could undergo significant change every day seemed unthinkable.
Yeah.
However, the evidence since then has been overwhelming. Even the most skeptical scientists have come to accept the power of neuroplasticity. It really shook the foundations of neuroscience.
And it's not just about learning new skills or, changing habits. The book shares a really profound example of neuroplasticity in action. Cameron Mott.
Oh, yes. Cameron's story is an incredible example.
What happened with her?
So Cameron was 9 years old, and she was suffering from these really severe, life-threatening seizures. As a last resort, doctors made the incredibly difficult decision to remove an entire hemisphere of her brain.
An entire hemisphere.
Her left hemisphere. Given that the brain controls movement, they anticipated years of paralysis,
Yeah.
possibly permanent.
Yeah.
But after the surgery, something remarkable happened. She started moving in ways that no one expected. The only explanation was that the right side of her brain was rapidly taking over the functions of the missing left hemisphere.
Oh, wow. So half a brain taking over the function of the other half.
Exactly. And this happened at a speed that doctors had never imagined possible. This really emphasizes that the brain's ability to rewire itself is far greater than we ever thought.
That is just incredible. And speaking of potential, the book also shares some compelling results from that Stanford math camp that you were involved in.
Yes, I was fortunate enough to be part of that.
Yeah.
So we invited 83 middle school students to Stanford for this 18-day math camp.
Okay.
And what was really interesting is that on the very first day, every single student told the interviewers that they were not a math person.
That sounds familiar.
Right. And they could all point to that one kid in their class that they thought was a math person, usually the one that answered questions the fastest.
Right. Like that kid is just naturally good at math. I'm not.
Exactly. They had this ingrained belief that some people are just born with a math brain.
And others aren't. Yeah.
Right. So during the camp, our focus was on challenging and changing those beliefs. We gave them the same math test that their school district had given them before they arrived.
Okay.
And then we gave them the same test again at the end of the 18 days.
Oh, wow.
And the results were incredible. On average, each student improved their score by 50%.
50%.
That's like the equivalent of almost 3 years of school
In how long?
in just over 2 weeks.
Wow. That's a huge improvement.
It's really powerful evidence that, when these limiting beliefs are addressed, so much learning potential can be unlocked.
Yeah. Believing you can get better actually leads to getting better.
That's exactly it.
So let's delve a little deeper into this. Why are these fixed ideas about ability so harmful, especially in a subject like mathematics?
Well, the book highlights the widespread impact, the negative impact of fixed mindsets, and particularly in math. A concerning statistic the book points out is that around 50% of students in introductory college math courses suffer from math anxiety.
Math anxiety.
Yes. And that anxiety often stems directly from this belief that math ability is just an inherent trait. You either have it or you don't. So when they encounter difficulty, it just reinforces this feeling that they're not good enough.
Yeah.
And it creates this damaging cycle.
Yeah. It's a vicious cycle. Like struggling becomes evidence of their fixed ability instead of just a normal part of learning.
Exactly.
And, thinking about this, the book shares a pretty disheartening story from, I think it was one of your students.
Yes, it was one of my students at Stanford. She told me this story, and it really stuck with me. So she'd done really well on a math exam, exceptionally well. But instead of receiving congratulations, she was met with suspicion and even discouragement from the professor.
No.
Yes, he questioned whether she'd cheated or simply memorized the material.
Oh, wow. That's awful.
It was. Essentially, he was implying that he didn't believe she was capable of actually understanding the math. He even suggested that she consider other fields.
Oh, my goodness.
She was devastated,
Yeah.
understandably so, and she started to doubt her own abilities.
Yeah.
It's a sad illustration of how deeply ingrained this fixed mindset thinking can be.
Even among educators, people who are supposed to be encouraging learning.
I know, it's pretty discouraging.
So what happened? Did she give up?
No.
Oh,
Thankfully, she had a very wise mother.
okay.
Her mother, who was also a teacher, encouraged her to think about why people succeed in math. What was it about them? And that question planted a seed. This initial understanding of a growth mindset, the belief that abilities can be developed through hard work.
I like that.
Yeah. It ignited this determination in her. She wanted to prove that professor wrong.
Good for her.
And she did. She excelled in the course and went on to have a very successful career.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's a powerful reminder of how important it is to challenge those fixed mindsets.
Yeah. The book also discusses this practice of tracking in schools, which seems very connected to fixed mindsets.
Absolutely.
So, for people who might not be familiar with tracking, what is it exactly?
So tracking is when students are grouped together based on their perceived ability,
Mm.
and then they're taught separately in those groups, and this starts at a very young age.
Wow. So, they're kind of labeled from the get go.
Yes, and the problem is that these labels can become self-fulfilling prophecies.
Right. Because if you're told you're in the low ability group, you might start to believe that's true.
Exactly. And then you might not try as hard. Or you might give up more easily when you face challenges.
And the book mentions a UK study that found that 88% of students placed in a particular track at age 4 remained in that same track for their whole school career.
That's right. It's a very sobering statistic. It highlights how these early labels can have really long-lasting consequences.
And it's not just in the UK, is it? The book also cites research from the US.
Yes, there was a study in the U.S. of nearly 12,000 students from kindergarten to third grade,
Okay.
and none of the students who started in the lowest reading group ever caught up to their peers in the highest group.
Wow. So it's really setting them up for a disadvantage from the beginning.
It really is. And the concerning thing is these grouping policies, they don't even lead to higher achievement for any group.
It's just perpetuating these inequalities.
Exactly.
Well, on a more hopeful note, the book explores how this science of neuroplasticity offers real hope for individuals who have been diagnosed with learning disabilities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most exciting things about neuroplasticity is that it offers so much hope for people who have been told that their learning challenges are permanent.
Mm.
Traditionally, the approach has often been to try to accommodate for those weaknesses.
Okay.
But the book highlights a different approach. That's being pioneered by Barbara Arrowsmith Young.
Okay.
She's established these Arrowsmith schools that use specific brain training exercises to actually strengthen weaker neural pathways.
So instead of just working around the weakness, you're actually targeting and strengthening it.
Exactly. And the results have been really remarkable.
Yeah, and the book shares stories from students who have gone through this program, and it sounds really transformative.
Yeah, many of them describe this experience of a fog lifting from their mind.
Hmm.
And they talk about gaining a clarity and understanding that they never had before.
What?
One of the stories in the book is about a young lawyer named Shannon, who was concerned about how long it took her to complete her work. After participating in the Aerosmith program, she described it as life-changing. She became so much more efficient in her thinking, and she was able to make connections that she hadn't been able to make before.
Hmm. So it wasn't just about speed, it was about depth of understanding, too.
Absolutely. It was about strengthening those cognitive abilities that were holding her back. And it's not just for students. Adults can benefit from this type of brain training as well.
That's really encouraging. And it sounds like Aerosmith Young's work is reaching more and more people.
Yes, she's developed programs that educators can be trained in to implement in their own schools.
Oh, that's great.
She's also developed remote programs, so it's becoming much more accessible. And while she's faced some criticism, which is common when you're doing something new and innovative,
Right.
she's remained committed to empowering these students who have been told that they're somehow limited.
Mhm.
Her work is based on the idea that learning difficulties don't have to be a life sentence.
Yeah, it's not a fixed limitation.
Exactly.
And the book highlights other inspiring stories of individuals who, really defied expectations despite facing learning challenges, like Dylan Lin.
Oh, Dylan's story is so inspiring. She was diagnosed with dyscalculia,
Which is?
which is a condition that makes learning math incredibly challenging.
Oh, wow.
But she refused to believe that she couldn't do it. She persevered,
Yeah.
developed her own unique strategies, and ultimately earned a degree in statistics.
Wow.
Her story is an amazing example of what's possible when we don't accept limitations.
Hmm.
She actually now collaborates with a professor to share her experiences and inspire other learners who have been told that they can't achieve their goals.
That's amazing. Talk about turning your challenge into, like, a way to help others.
It's a beautiful example of that.
The book also discusses this study that compared brain activity in students with and without mathematical learning disabilities after targeted tutoring.
Yes, that study was really fascinating. What it showed was that after 8 weeks of intensive one-on-one tutoring both groups, the students with the disabilities and those without, they achieved the same results on these math problems.
Okay.
And not only that, but their brain scans showed the same areas of their brains lighting up.
So it wasn't that the students with the disabilities had less brain activity. It was that their brains weren't being activated in the same way.
Exactly. The study really challenges this misconception that learning disabilities mean less brain activity. It suggests that with the right support and instruction, different brains can reach the same levels of understanding.
It's like they were just learning in a different way.
Exactly.
That with the right support, they could learn just as effectively as anyone else.
Absolutely. And that's a really powerful message. It means that we need to be more focused on providing individualized support and recognizing that different learners have different strengths and challenges.
Okay, so we've talked about the myth of fixed mindsets, the power of neuroplasticity, the impact of learning challenges. Now let's move on to another deeply ingrained concept that the book really challenges, this idea of giftedness.
Yeah. Giftedness is a tricky concept, and the book argues that it's not only inaccurate and potentially harmful,
Mm.
but it also carries significant gender and racial biases.
Mm.
There's a lot of evidence for this. Seth Stevens-Davowitz, he analyzed Google search data, and he found that parent search is my son gifted 2.5 times more often than is my daughter gifted.
Wow.
So even though young children of different genders have equal potential, there's this ingrained bias.
Wow. That's so interesting and kind of disturbing.
It is. It shows that these biases are present, even from a very young age. And they can really influence who gets encouraged and who doesn't.
Especially in fields like STEM,
Right, exactly.
science, technology, engineering, and math.
Yeah. And the book argues that if we could shift away from this notion of natural giftedness and recognize that everyone is on a learning journey with the potential for growth, we could start to reduce these biases and allow for a much wider range of thinkers to contribute.
Right, because we're limiting ourselves if we only focus on this narrow definition of who's gifted.
Exactly. We're missing out on so much potential. The book shares this inspiring story of Maryam Mirzakhani. She was the first woman to win the Fields Medal.
In mathematics.
In mathematics, it's the highest honor in the field.
Wow.
And what's interesting is that she actually wasn't initially drawn to math. She grew up in Iran. And in 7th grade, her math teacher actually told her that she wasn't good at math.
No way.
Yes. Fortunately, she had other teachers who believed in her.
Okay.
But it's a sobering thought to think that her potential could have been overlooked if she had internalized that early judgment.
That's a good point, because it just goes to show that even someone who achieves the highest level of recognition in a field could have easily been discouraged early on.
Exactly.
And the book also mentions J.K. Rowling's experience, with her Harry Potter books.
Ooh, yes.
Being rejected by multiple publishers before finally finding success.
Yeah, she faced 12 rejections from different publishers before Bloomsbury finally took a chance on her book.
Wow.
And even then, it was reportedly the editor's young daughter who championed it.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting.
So it's a reminder that persistence is key.
Yeah.
Even when you're faced with setbacks.
And the book also points out that this gifted label can actually have negative consequences for those who receive it. It shares a story about a student named Susanna that really illustrates this point.
Yeah, Susanna was identified as gifted in math throughout her childhood.
Yeah.
And she was constantly told that she had a math brain. So she enrolled as a math major in college. But in her second year, she struggled in a challenging course. And because of her fixed belief in a math brain, she concluded that she must not actually have one.
Right.
So she dropped out of the program. What she didn't understand was that encountering challenges, struggling,
Yeah.
that's actually vital for brain growth. If she had known that, she probably would have persevered. But that label of gifted became a burden rather than a source of strength.
Right. It created this expectation of effortless success.
Exactly.
Which is not realistic. Nobody learns without making mistakes and encountering challenges.
Absolutely. Everyone struggles as part of the process. And that's something that Daniel Coyle highlights in his research on talent hotbeds. He found that the teachers in these places that consistently produce high achievers,
Okay.
they rarely see someone as a genius, maybe one in a decade.
Wow.
And Anders Ericsson, who has studied expertise extensively, he argues that even people we consider geniuses, like Einstein or Mozart, they weren't born that way. Their extraordinary achievements were the result of intense hard work and practice.
So geniuses are made, not born.
That's right.
And you shared a personal experience from your own high school days in the book that really shines a light on the damaging impact of fixed ideas, especially around gender and ability.
Oh, yeah. It was a physics exam. We'd taken a practice exam.
Okay.
And a group of us 4 girls and 4 boys had gotten these similar borderline scores.
Okay.
My physics teacher concluded that the boys had gotten those scores without trying very hard,
Oh, no.
whereas the girls had worked hard and had basically reached their limit.
No.
Yes. And so he entered all the boys for the higher level exam and all the girls for the lower level one.
Oh, my goodness. Based solely on his perception of their ability.
Exactly.
Right.
Based on his fixed idea of their potential, which was completely wrong.
And obviously that really limited the opportunities for the girls.
It did. And it's just one small example of how these fixed ideas can play out in the real world.
It's so important to be aware of those biases, not just in education, but in all areas of life. Because these ideas about potential, they can have a really negative impact.
They can. The book mentions that even the workplace, professionals who before they understood about brain growth,
Yeah.
they were hesitant to share their ideas in meetings for fear of being wrong.
Right, right.
Because they were afraid of being judged. And it stemmed from this belief that their intelligence was fixed
Yeah.
and that making mistakes was a sign of weakness. But when we understand that our brains grow, we can start to see mistakes as opportunities for learning.
Okay, so let's move on to the second key to limitless learning that the book presents, which is embracing mistakes and struggle.
Yes, it might sound counterintuitive
It does.
because we've been taught to avoid mistakes.
Right.
But the book argues that the times when we're challenged, the times when we make mistakes,
Yeah.
those are actually the most crucial times for our brains to grow.
So those moments of frustration when we feel like we're not getting it, those are actually really important.
They are. Because when we're willing to grapple with those difficulties and to learn from our errors,
Yeah.
we're actually strengthening the connections in our brains that make future learning faster and more effective. And this isn't just a feel-good idea. It's backed up by research.
So it's not just about feeling good about making mistakes. It's about the actual physical changes that happen in our brains when we make those mistakes.
Exactly.
Okay.
For example, Daniel Coyle, in his research on talent hotbeds, he found that the people who really excel in different fields, they engage in a very specific type of practice. He calls it deliberate, error-focused practice. And this kind of practice, it actually leads to the insulation of brain pathways with myelin, which increases their efficiency.
So making mistakes is actually making our brains work better.
That's right. The times when we're struggling, when we're making mistakes, those are the times when our brains are growing the most.
The book uses a great example of this, a musician named Clarissa who's practicing the clarinet.
Yes, Clarissa's story is a great illustration of this.
What did her practice sessions look like?
So to an untrained ear, her practice might have sounded like a series of mistakes. She would play a few notes, stop abruptly, correct yourself, try again, hit a wrong note, backtrack. It seemed full of these interruptions.
Yeah.
And imperfections.
Right.
But a music expert who watched the recording of her practice described it as amazing because she was engaging in this really effective, targeted practice. Each correction, each pause to analyze and adjust was strengthening the connections in her brain.
So it was like this constant cycle of making mistakes and then learning from them.
Exactly. And that's what led to her improvement. And the book also compares the mathematics curriculum in the U.S. to those in high-performing countries like Japan.
Okay.
And it finds that there's a big difference in how mistakes are viewed and how struggle is approached in the classroom. So in international assessments, like the Kim study, the U.S. curriculum, it tends to be a mile wide and an inch deep.
Meaning?
Meaning that it covers a lot of topics, but doesn't go into much depth on any of them.
Okay.
In contrast, countries like Japan, they dedicate a lot more time to students inventing, thinking, and grappling with concepts. Students in the U.S., they engage in this kind of deep conceptual work much less frequently.
And that difference in approach to learning, it also plays out in how mistakes are handled in the classroom, right?
Absolutely. Jim Stigler, he was part of a research team that was studying teaching practices. And he observed that in Japan, teachers often want their students to struggle.
Really?
They might even intentionally give incorrect answers.
Wow. To make them think.
Exactly. To make them go back and really engage with the concepts to figure out why it's wrong.
I like that.
Whereas in the U.S., there's this tendency to want to shield students from struggle.
Right, right.
Teachers often break down tasks into very small, easy steps. And while this might lead to students completing the work and feeling successful in the short term, it often limits genuine learning.
Because they're not really being challenged to think for themselves.
That's right.
And the book also talks about some really innovative teaching methods in China that embrace struggle.
Yes. Teachers in China were observed asking these thought-provoking questions and deliberately making incorrect statements to encourage their students to really think critically and to debate the concepts.
Mm,
For example, in a lesson about complementary and supplementary angles, a teacher might present a slightly incorrect definition
okay.
and then have the students discuss and justify their understanding to arrive at the correct definition.
Mm. So it's like they're creating this productive struggle on purpose
Exactly. The whole lesson was designed to get students stuck.
and to have to work their way out of it.
Yes, because that's when the real learning happens. And the book shares a really great anecdote about a second-grade student, Dex, who experienced this kind of learning.
Okay.
So Dex was working on a task involving the number 4, and he was exploring different ways to combine it with other numbers. And through that exploration, he independently discovered the commutative property of addition, which basically means that the order in which you add numbers doesn't change the sum.
Okay.
And his teachers, Suzanne, she recognized how significant this discovery was,
Yeah.
even though it came from what might have initially seemed like an error,
Right.
and she named it the Dex factor.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a real celebration of his learning. And his classmates, who might have previously seen him as less capable, they started to see him as someone with these really insightful ideas,
Mm.
all because of this mistake-driven learning.
So it's not just about, tolerating mistakes. It's about celebrating them as opportunities for learning.
That's right. And the book shares a funny anecdote about the principal challenging this idea of learning from mistakes.
Oh, I remember that story.
He joked that he could just go around saying that 5 plus 3 is 10 and expect his brain to grow.
Right. Right.
And the students were quick to point out that intentionally getting something wrong isn't the same as genuinely grappling with an error.
It's the process of working through that mistake that leads to the learning. And there are some really inspiring examples in the book of teachers who have created classroom cultures that really value and encourage struggle.
Absolutely. Teachers like Jennifer, who uses a metaphor of steps of struggle to normalize the experience of being challenged.
Tell me more about that.
So she uses the visual of steps to represent the learning process when you're faced with a challenge.
Okay.
And she tells her students that it's okay not to be the smug person on the top step who finished immediately.
Right. Right.
And they shouldn't be the sad person at the bottom of the steps who feels defeated.
Yeah.
The important thing is to be on the steps of struggle,
I love that.
because that's where the real learning happens.
Hmm.
And she even celebrates when students say that they're deep in the pit of struggle.
Hmm.
And she'll ask them, what resources do you need? How can we work through this together?
I like that.
Instead of just giving them the answers,
Yeah.
it's about normalizing and valuing that experience of being challenged.
Hmm.
Another teacher, Leah Haverth, she has a really great approach as well.
Okay.
She gradually withdraws support as her students work on more difficult tasks. And she also shares her own past struggles with them.
Vulnerability as a teacher.
Exactly. And it really helps her students to build confidence and resilience.
Yeah, and it shows them that it's okay to struggle.
Yes.
And that everyone goes through it.
Absolutely.
So it all comes back to this idea that our brains grow and change and that mistakes and struggle, they're not signs of failure, but they're essential parts of that growth process.
Exactly. And when we can shift our mindset to embrace that, it can be so liberating.
Absolutely.
Because then we're not afraid to take risks, to try new things. And that's what ultimately leads to growth.
Okay. So we've talked about the importance of embracing mistakes and struggle, and really shifting away from this idea of fixed mindsets. But the book introduces a third key to limitless learning that I think is even more surprising: expert speaker.